You don't have the coverage. Take him somewhere public." They turned the single father's son away at the hospital doors, told him without premium insurance his boy wasn't their priority, security already stepping closer. The janitor didn't argue. He just looked at the surgical board. 10 minutes later, the chief surgeon couldn't move his hands, because the man they dismissed knew exactly what was coming. This is about who gets denied and who decides who lives. Before I show you the exact moment when the chief surgeon recognized the janitor from a battlefield operating tent, by the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. What was really happening beneath the surface wasn't about paperwork. It was about power. About who gets rushed through glass doors and who gets stopped by them. Security hovered close enough to touch his shoulder. Elias Rowan stood there in his faded maintenance jacket, his 8-year-old son limp against his chest. Noah's fingers were twisted in the collar of his father's shirt, small knuckles pale, breath coming in shallow pulls that rattled faintly. The automatic doors slid shut behind them with a whisper that felt final. He didn't raise his voice, didn't beg, didn't argue. Instead, the hospital janitor, oil-stained cuffs, worn boots, badge clipped slightly crooked, tilted his head toward the illuminated surgical board mounted above the reception desk. His eyes tracked the scrolling names, the operating room assignments, the procedure codes. Calm, focused, unshaken. "You're blocking the entrance," the receptionist snapped. He shifted slightly, not in retreat but in adjustment, keeping Noah upright so the boy could breathe easier. His palm pressed lightly against his son's back, counting the rhythm there. Too fast. Too shallow. Noah tried to speak. "Dad. It hurts." "I know," he murmured softly. "I've got you." The chief surgeon approached then, heels sharp against polished tile, white coat pristine, authority radiating from every measured step. Dr. Celine Vale didn't look at the child first. She looked at the badge on his chest. "Maintenance staff aren't authorized to override admissions," she said coolly. "If you're off shift, you need to leave." He met her gaze without flinching. There was no pleading in his eyes, no humiliation either, just calculation. "You're running a splenic repair in R3, he said quietly. "If the patient destabilizes, you'll need faster access to blood than your current cross-match protocol allows." A flicker, barely there, passed across her expression. "That's inappropriate," she replied, tone sharpening. "Security." But he wasn't finished looking at the board. And he wasn't guessing. The scrolling line showed a donor case, high profile. Complicated. He adjusted Noah's weight again, listening, really listening, to the boy's breathing, to the subtle hitch between each inhale. The antiseptic scent in the lobby mixed with faint coffee and expensive perfume. A fountain trickled against marble. Somewhere deeper inside the surgical wing, a monitor alarm chimed once, distant and sharp. Elias's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Noah's pain wasn't random, it was building. The nurse near the desk, Maribel Soto, badge clipped neatly, watched him with growing unease. She'd seen desperate parents before. Panic, rage, collapse. This wasn't that. This man was assessing. "Sir," she said gently, stepping closer, lowering her voice. "We can call an ambulance to transfer him. He won't make a transfer," he answered, not harshly, simply certain. Dr. Vale exhaled sharply. "You're not a physician. You're facilities support. Don't presume to diagnose." Silence settled between them, thick as the polished glass walls surrounding the executive wing. He could have said many things in that moment, could have listed credentials, could have demanded review. Instead, he glanced once more at R3 on the board, then back at her. 10 minutes, he said evenly. She frowned. "Excuse me?" 10 minutes, he repeated, voice low but steady. And you're going to wish I was inside that room. Security finally touched his shoulder, not roughly, just enough. Noah whimpered. The doors opened again, admitting a gust of cold air and a sharply dressed couple heading toward private check-in. Class difference hung in the space like a curtain. Dr. Vale stepped aside to allow the donors through. Remove him, she ordered. And Elias let himself be guided backward, not resisting, not protesting, just watching the surgical wing doors as they sealed shut again with a soft hydraulic sigh. He counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3. Above them, the surgical board continued to glow. Behind those doors, lives balanced on precision. And he knew exactly how fragile precision could be. 4, 5, 6. Security's grip tightened slightly on his elbow as they guided him toward the far end of the lobby, closer to the exit and away from the polished admissions desk. Noah's breathing hitched against his chest, a thin, trembling sound that cut through the soft music drifting from hidden ceiling speakers. 7, 8. Maribel's eyes followed them, worrying, pulling at her features, but she didn't step out of line. Not yet. 9. Then it happened. The calm hum of the hospital fractured. A sharp alarm pierced through the corridor doors leading to surgery, high, insistent, nothing like the polite notification chimes that echoed earlier. This one carried urgency. Panic. Elias stopped counting. Inside or 3, the donor's procedure had entered dangerous territory. Dr. Celine Vale heard it instantly. Her head snapped toward the sealed surgical doors. A nurse rushed through, moments later, pale beneath fluorescent lights. "We've got a sudden drop. Pressure's crashing," the nurse blurted. "Massive internal bleed." Vale's composure tightened like a drawn wire. "Clamp and pack. Increase fluids. I'm coming." She moved fast, white coat flaring behind her as she disappeared through the doors. The board above flickered, or 3 status shifted from active to critical. Elias didn't move toward the exit. He stepped forward instead. Security hesitated. "Sir, you need to leave." "No," he said quietly. There was no heat in it. No defiance for pride's sake, just certainty. Noah's fingers twitched against his collar. The boy's skin felt cooler now. Maribel crossed the distance between them, voice low. "What's happening in there?" He kept his gaze on the surgical doors. "They missed a secondary tear," he replied. "Probably posterior. It'll flood before they see it." Her brow furrowed. "You can't know that." He shifted Noah carefully, adjusting the boy's position to ease pressure. The procedure they listed, splenic repair on a hypertensive donor with prior trauma. The board updated twice in 3 minutes. That means unexpected complications. Another alarm shrieked, louder. Staff sprinted past, pushing a crash cart. Maribel's breath caught. "How do you know what that means?" His eyes flicked to her at last. Calm, focused, because I've seen it before, the surgical doors burst open again. A resident's voice cracked as she shouted, "We need O negative now." Blood supply attendants scrambled. Through the narrow window in the door, chaos flickered, gloved hands moving too fast, suction pooling red. Vale's voice carried faintly, sharper than before. Controlled, but strained. "Where is the source? I can't see it." Elias closed his eyes for half a second. He could picture it. The cavity filling. The blind spot near the spine. The slow realization that standard protocol wasn't enough. Noah let out a weak cry. Maribel swallowed. "Sir, if you know something." He stepped toward the doors. Security moved to block him, but she lifted a hand. "Wait." Another monitor flatlined briefly before stuttering back. Inside, hesitation stretched too long. He spoke without raising his voice. "If they keep searching anteriorly, they'll lose him." The words were measured. Clinical. Maribel stared at him, the pieces starting to shift. Who are you?" Before he could answer, a second nurse rushed out. "Dr. Vale needs another set of hands, someone experienced with combat trauma protocols." Her gaze landed on the janitor's jacket, then on his steady posture, then back toward the room where panic simmered. Elias met her eyes, no boasting, no grand declaration, just readiness. Security faltered. "He's maintenance. I don't care what he is," the nurse snapped. "Can he help?" Silence pressed in around them. Maribel's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Can you?" He looked down at Noah for a heartbeat, thumb brushing the boy's hairline. "I won't leave him," he said quietly. "You don't have to," Maribel replied, stepping closer. "I'll stay with your son." Another alarm screamed from inside, or 3. Time was bleeding away. He lifted his gaze back to the surgical doors, expression sharpening into something unmistakable, authority long buried now rising. "I'll need full scrub access," he said evenly, "and someone to prepare 4 units, not 2. The nurse blinked. 4? Yes. Maribel exhaled slowly, realization settling deep. This wasn't guesswork. This was knowledge earned somewhere harsher than marble floors and donor plaques. From inside the OR, Vale's voice cracked through the chaos. "We're losing him." Elias handed Noah gently into Maribel's arms. The boy whimpered, but didn't wake fully. He leaned close to his son's ear. "I'll be right there. Stay strong." Then he straightened. Security stepped aside without being asked. As he moved toward the surgical doors, he didn't rush. He didn't look back, and as the doors slid open to swallow him into sterile white light, he spoke just loudly enough for Maribel to hear. "Tell her to rotate posterior. Now. If this moment hits you, if you believe people aren't what their uniforms say, subscribe with the bell on. Because what's about to happen inside that operating room will change more than one life." The doors sealed behind him. And inside, or 3, the chief surgeon turned toward the unexpected figure entering her battlefield. The doors sealed with a hydraulic hush behind him, cutting off the polished quiet of the lobby and replacing it with the raw pulse of crisis. Bright surgical lights flooded his vision. The air was sharp with antiseptic and cauterized metal. Monitors screamed in uneven rhythm, each alarm slicing through the room like a warning shot. Dr. Celine Vale stood at the operating table, gloved hands deep inside the open cavity of the donor's abdomen. Blood pooled faster than suction could clear it. Her jaw was tight, eyes scanning frantically for a source she couldn't fully see. She didn't look up at first. "Who authorized?" she began, irritation already rising. Then she glanced toward the doorway. For half a second, confusion crossed her face at the sight of the maintenance jacket being stripped off by a scrub nurse. "This is not the time for." He identified the complication. The nurse cut in quickly. "Posterior tear." Vale's expression hardened. "We're handling it." He stepped forward, already scrubbing in with swift, economical movements. Muscle memory guided him. Water, antiseptic, rinse, repeat. No wasted motion, no hesitation. The donor's blood pressure dipped again. 80 systolic, a resident called out, voice shaking. Vale's composure thinned, increased fluids. Clamp higher. "It's not anterior," he said calmly, stepping beside her as a nurse secured sterile gloves over his hands. "You won't see it from there," she shot him a sharp look. "You're overstepping." He met her gaze evenly. No challenge, no apology. Just certainty. "It's tracking behind the spleen," he continued, voice steady despite the chaos. "Small tear, hard to visualize. You'll keep chasing shadows unless you rotate." For a fraction of a second, pride battled logic in her eyes. Another alarm pierced the room. 75, the anesthesiologist warned. Time collapsed into seconds. Vale exhaled sharply. "Rotate," she ordered. The team adjusted. Suction shifted. Retractors moved. There, a dark well of blood pulsed from a hidden angle near the spine. The resident gasped. "I see it." He didn't wait for permission. His hands moved with precise confidence, fingers navigating the cavity as if retracing a path memorized years ago under far less forgiving lights. "Clamp," he instructed. A nurse placed the instrument in his palm without questioning. He worked in silence, movements controlled and deliberate. The tremor in the room steadied around him, staff subconsciously aligning with the rhythm he set. Vale watched, stunned despite herself. "You've done this before," she muttered. "More times than I can count," he replied quietly. He secured the tear, suturing with clean, practiced efficiency. Blood flow slowed. Suction cleared. The monitor's frantic beeping softened. Pressure rising, the anesthesiologist said, disbelief creeping into her voice. 90, 95. Relief didn't wash over him. Not yet. 4 units, he reminded. "They're on the way," a nurse answered. Vale stepped back half a pace, eyes fixed on his hands. There was no fumbling, no uncertainty, just mastery. As the final suture tightened, the bleeding stopped completely. Silence fell over the room except for the steadier, more reassuring rhythm of the heart monitor. 100 systolic. A collective breath released. He withdrew his hands slowly, scanning the surgical field one last time. "Stabilized," he said. Vale stared at the repaired site, then at him. "Who are you?" she asked, the earlier arrogance replaced with something closer to disbelief. He peeled off his gloves methodically. "Not maintenance," one of the residents whispered under her breath. He met Vale's gaze again, the fluorescent lights reflecting in eyes that had seen harsher places. "I told you," he said quietly. 10 minutes. Recognition flickered, faint but growing. The angle of his posture, the tone of his voice under pressure. Something tugged at her memory. Before she could grasp it fully, a nurse rushed toward him. "Your son, he's worse," she said urgently. "Severe abdominal guarding. He's barely responsive." The word son shifted everything in the room. Vale's focus snapped back. "What?" He didn't waste time. "He's presenting with early signs of internal rupture," he said, already stepping away from the table. "Left untreated, he'll crash." "You can't possibly," she started. He turned to her, expression sharpening. "I recognized the symptoms before I walked in here," he said. "I stayed because you were about to lose your donor." The weight of that settled heavily. "You let my child sit in your lobby," he continued, voice still controlled but edged now with restrained fury, "while you told me policy mattered more than triage." No one in the room moved. The donor lay stabilized because of him. Vale swallowed. "Prep another ore," she ordered abruptly. "Now." The staff scrambled again, but this time the energy was different, less panic, more purpose. As he stepped toward the doors, Vale followed. "Wait," she said, searching his face. "Have we met?" He paused just long enough to answer. "Afghanistan. Field hospital outside Kandahar. You visited for a conference." Her eyes widened. The fluorescent lights seemed suddenly too bright. "You were," she began. "Lead trauma surgeon," he finished quietly. And for the first time since this began, Dr. Celine Vale looked shaken. The recognition didn't arrive gently. It hit her in fragments, the desert heat pressing against canvas tents, the metallic scent of blood mingling with sand, the relentless pace of wounded soldiers carried in on stretchers. She remembered a younger version of herself walking through that field hospital as an observer, invited to lecture on surgical innovation. And she remembered the man who never stopped moving. "You're Rowan," she said slowly, disbelief threading through her voice. "Captain Elias Rowan." He didn't correct her rank, didn't confirm it either. He was already moving down the corridor toward the elevators, scrubs rustling, pace controlled but urgent. My son needs imaging immediately, he said. Left quadrant. Likely splenic or mesenteric involvement. He doesn't have hours. Vale fell into step beside him, heels echoing sharply against the polished floor. Staff pressed themselves against the walls to let them pass. Word traveled faster than footsteps. That's not possible, she muttered, more to herself than to him. You left medicine. He pressed the elevator button. I left a uniform. The doors opened. They stepped inside. The mirrored walls reflected two very different figures. Her immaculate white coat still pristine despite the crisis, and him in borrowed surgical scrubs, sleeves slightly too short, posture unyielding. The doors slid shut. For a moment there was only the hum of descent and the faint beeping of distant monitors filtering through the shaft. You could have said who you were, she said quietly. He kept his eyes forward. Would it have changed your decision? Silence answered her. Noah lay in a treatment bay when they reached the emergency unit. Maribel hovered beside him, one hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder, whispering reassurance. The child's face had lost color. His breathing was shallow, uneven. Elias crossed the room in 3 strides. I'm here, he murmured, fingers brushing Noah's forehead. The boy's eyelids fluttered. Dad, I've got you. Vale watched the exchange, something tightening in her chest. The steadiness he'd shown in the operating room was here too, but softer, gentler. Prep CT, she ordered briskly. Now? A tech hesitated. Insurance clearance, now, she repeated, sharper this time. The machine whirred to life minutes later, its circular mouth swallowing the stretcher inch by inch. Elias walked alongside, one hand never leaving his son. Inside the control room, images began to appear, cross-sectional slices of fragile anatomy. Gray, white, shadow. He leaned toward the screen. There, he said immediately. A subtle bloom of internal bleeding, not yet catastrophic, but close. Vale stepped closer, eyes narrowing. It's small, for now, he replied. It won't stay that way. She studied the scan again, jaw tightening. You're right, she admitted quietly. There was no triumph in his expression, only urgency. You should have triaged him, he said, not accusing, just stating fact. I was following protocol, she answered, though the words sounded thinner now. And protocol nearly cost 2 lives tonight. The tech cleared his throat. He's destabilizing. On the monitor, Noah's vitals flickered downward. Vale inhaled slowly. Prep or 2, as the team mobilized, she turned to him. You can't operate on your own child. I know, he said. But you'll follow my plan. It wasn't a challenge. It was expectation. Her pride bristled, but only briefly. She had seen his hands in motion, seen the certainty that saved her donor. You'll assist, she decided. He nodded once. As they wheeled Noah toward surgery, staff stepped aside instinctively. The earlier whispers of maintenance had vanished. Now, glances carried something closer to awe and shame. In the reflection of a glass wall, Vale caught sight of herself beside him. Hours ago, she had dismissed him without a second look. Now she relied on him. The operating suite doors opened again, sterile light spilling outward like judgment. Inside or 2, the air felt heavier, more personal. This wasn't a donor. This was a child. His child. He scrubbed in without speaking, hand steady though his pulse hammered against his ribs. He could feel it, controlled, contained, but there. Vale watched him from across the sink. You never came back after Kandahar, she said quietly. He didn't look up. Some losses follow you home. She understood more than she wanted to. When they entered the operating room, Noah lay beneath bright lights, small body dwarfed by sterile drapes. Machines beeped in fragile rhythm. Elias took his position opposite Vale. Posterior approach, he instructed softly. Minimal disruption. She nodded. The room stilled. Outside, in the lobby where he had been turned away, the surgical board updated once more. Or 2, critical. And for everyone watching, the meaning of those letters had changed completely. Or 2, critical. The red lettering glowed on the surgical board outside, reflecting faintly against the polished floors where donors once paused for photographs. Inside, beneath the white blaze of operating lights, the air felt tighter, heavier, personal. Noah's small body lay draped in sterile blue, only the surgical field exposed. The steady beep of the cardiac monitor filled the silence between breaths. Elias stood opposite Dr. Celine Vale, gloved hands poised but controlled. He did not look at the board. He did not look at the observing residents pressed behind the glass. He looked at the anatomy before him. "Posterior entry," he said quietly. "Slow. Don't chase what you can't see." Vale nodded once. Incision. Steel met skin. The room moved as one, but the rhythm was his. Suction hummed softly. A metallic scent rose as cautery sealed delicate vessels. Beneath the lights, sweat gathered at his temples, but his hands never trembled. "Pressure's dipping," the anesthesiologist warned. "I know," he replied calmly. "It will." Vale's jaw tightened. "Explain." "The tear is smaller than the donor's," he said evenly, "but it's deeper. You'll think you've stabilized it too soon." Her eyes flicked to him, then back to the field. There, a thin bloom of red, subtle, easy to miss. "I see it," she murmured. "Clamp." She obeyed without hesitation. The room quieted except for the steady, fragile rhythm of Noah's heartbeat. Every movement carried weight now, not institutional pride, not donor reputation, but the life of a child who had been told he wasn't important enough. "4 units ready," a nurse said softly. "2 will do," Elias replied. "He's stronger than he looks." Vale studied him across the table. "You read the scan faster than my attending," she said under her breath. He didn't answer immediately. His focus remained unbroken. "I read it like a father," he said finally. The suture slid through tissue with clean precision. Each knot tied carried a memory, field tents shaking in desert wind, soldiers whispering apologies for wounds that weren't their fault. He pushed those memories aside. This wasn't a battlefield. This was his son. Pressure stabilizing, came the update. Vale exhaled, a sound she hadn't realized she was holding. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. Silence fell except for the reassuring cadence of the monitor climbing steadily upward. 100, 105. The crisis that had threatened to steal everything eased beneath their hands. Elias scanned the site once more, double-checking every angle, every shadow. "No secondary tear," he said quietly. "Close." Vale stepped back half a pace, studying the repair. "You were right," she admitted. There was no audience applause inside the sterile room, but beyond the glass, staff who had witnessed the earlier humiliation now watched in stunned stillness. The man they'd escorted toward the exit now guided their chief surgeon with quiet authority. As the final sutures were placed, he allowed himself one breath, slow and controlled. Noah was safe. The anesthesiologist adjusted settings. "He'll need monitoring, but he's stable." Vale removed her gloves, gaze lingering on the small body beneath the drapes. "He should never have been denied triage," she said quietly. "No," Elias answered. The weight of that word hung heavier than any accusation. Outside the OR, whispers spread through corridors once lined with donor plaques and policy manuals. Maintenance. Captain. Trauma surgeon. Father. Titles blurred. Vale stepped closer to him, lowering her voice. "Why didn't you fight harder in the lobby?" He peeled off his gloves slowly. "Because arguing wouldn't have saved him," he replied. "Skill would." The truth of it landed without defense. A nurse cleared her throat near the door. The board members are asking questions. Vale's expression hardened but differently now, not defensive. Resolute. They'll get answers, she said. Elias looked down at Noah's face as sedation deepened his rest. He brushed a hand lightly against his son's hair, careful not to disturb wires or tubing. "You did good, kid," he murmured. If this moment reminds you that real strength doesn't wear a label, subscribe with the bell on. Because the reckoning outside this operating room is just beginning. He straightened. Beyond the glass walls, hospital leadership gathered, men and women in tailored suits who had once glanced past him without seeing. Now they waited. Vale met his eyes again. "Walk with me," she said. The surgical doors opened, releasing them into a corridor thick with expectation. And this time, when staff stepped aside, it wasn't to escort him out. It was to let him pass. The corridor outside or two felt different now, quieter, charged with something unspoken. Nurses who had once averted their eyes held his gaze as he walked beside Dr. Celine Vey. The sharp scent of antiseptic lingered, but beneath it was something else. Recognition. Through the wide glass panels overlooking the executive waiting lounge, members of the hospital board stood in a tense cluster. Tailored suits, polished shoes, phones gripped tightly. The donor's family occupied one side of the room, pale but relieved. Vale pushed through the double doors first. "He's stable," she announced, voice carrying its usual authority, but stripped of earlier edge. "The hemorrhage has been repaired." A wave of relieved murmurs filled the lounge. "And the second surgery?" One board member asked, glancing uncertainly toward Elias in borrowed scrubs. "Also stable," she replied. Their eyes shifted to him. Not maintenance, not anymore. One of the senior board members, a silver-haired man with a silk pocket square, frowned. "I was told there was confusion earlier in admissions." There it was, the polished language of institutional deflection. Vale didn't hesitate. There was an error in judgment. Silence followed that admission. Elias felt every gaze in the room, but didn't flinch. His pulse had finally slowed, though exhaustion pressed faintly behind his eyes. The donor's wife stepped forward, hands trembling slightly. "Are you the doctor who saved my husband?" He nodded once, part of a team. Her eyes glistened. "Thank you." He accepted the gratitude quietly. No flourish, no correction. The board member cleared his throat again. "And your position here?" Before Elias could respond, Vale spoke. "He is a former military trauma surgeon," she said evenly. Captain Elias Rowan. The name settled heavily. Recognition rippled across a few faces. News articles, medical journals, a commendation ceremony years ago. "You left practice," another executive said carefully. "I left active duty," Elias corrected, voice calm. Vale stepped closer to the board, shoulders squared. His assessment identified the donor's posterior tear when we couldn't visualize it. Without that intervention, the outcome would have been catastrophic. The blunt honesty shifted the air. "And his son?" someone asked. Vale didn't look away. His son required immediate surgical care. He was initially denied admission due to insurance status. The words landed harder than any accusation. A flicker of discomfort crossed several faces. "That policy exists for financial stability," the silver-haired board member replied defensively. Elias finally spoke. "Policy nearly killed 2 people tonight," he said quietly. No raised voice, no anger flaring outward, just fact. Outside the glass wall, staff gathered in small clusters, whispering. Some had watched him escorted toward the exit. Others had seen him step into an operating room and take command. Maribel stood near the doorway, arms folded, eyes bright with restrained emotion. The board member adjusted his cufflinks. "This is highly irregular." "So was the bleeding," Elias answered. Vale's lips almost twitched despite the tension. Another executive leaned forward. "What exactly are you suggesting, Dr. Rowan?" He considered the word doctor hanging there. "I'm suggesting," he said carefully, "that triage should never depend on coverage tiers. Not when minutes decide outcomes." The donor's wife nodded firmly. "He's right, that shifted something. Public pressure, reputation, the social weight of being witnessed." Vale stepped in again. "Emergency admission protocols will be reviewed effective immediately." The board members exchanged glances, calculating cost against liability, optics against ethics. Elias didn't push further. He didn't need to. The truth had unfolded in front of them, undeniable and clinical. One of the younger board members, a woman with sharp glasses and sharper eyes, asked softly, "Why are you working maintenance?" He met her gaze without embarrassment. "Because after war," he said quietly, "sometimes you need quieter work." The answer wasn't complete, but it was enough. Silence stretched again, not hostile this time. Reflective. Vale exhaled slowly. His credentials will be verified. In the meantime, he'll be retained as consulting trauma specialist pending formal review. A collective murmur passed through the executives. Retention. Consulting. Words that felt vastly different from removal. Elias glanced through the glass toward the pediatric recovery wing. "I'm going back to my son," he said. No one stopped him. As he walked away from the boardroom lounge, staff parted instinctively. The earlier humiliation had dissolved into something close to reverence. Maribel fell into step beside him. "They're already rewriting the narrative," she whispered. He gave a faint, tired smile. "Narratives don't matter." She glanced at him. "What does?" He looked ahead, toward the recovery doors where Noah lay. "Outcomes," he said. Behind them, the hospital's power structure was shifting, slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably. And for the first time that night, the building felt less like a fortress of privilege and more like a place where skill, not status, decided who walked out alive. He pushed through the pediatric recovery doors, the air warmer here, quieter. Machines hummed in softer tones. The harsh fluorescent glare of surgery gave way to dimmed lights meant for healing. Noah lay in a narrow bed surrounded by monitors that blinked steady reassurance. An IV line traced down to his small arm. Oxygen rested beneath his nose. His face had color again. Elias exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than lungs. Maribel paused at the doorway, giving him space. He stepped closer to the bed. "I'm here," he murmured. Noah's eyelids fluttered, heavy with sedation but responsive. "Dad? You did great," he said softly, brushing his thumb across his son's knuckles. "Tougher than anyone in that building." A faint attempt at a smile curved the boy's lips before sleep reclaimed him. Behind him, quiet footsteps approached. Dr. Celine Vale stopped a few feet away, hands clasped loosely in front of her. Without the surgical mask and gloves, she looked different, less armored. "He'll recover fully," she said. "No long-term damage. You caught it early." He nodded but didn't look away from his son. "I almost didn't," he replied quietly. The truth lingered between them. Vale stepped closer to the monitor, studying the stable vitals as if confirming her own words. "I reviewed the footage from admissions," she said after a moment. "Security's body cam. That made him glance up." "I was wrong," she continued, voice steady but stripped of pride. "I saw a uniform and assumed limitation. That's on me," he watched her carefully. "Outside this room, apologies might be strategic. In here, they had weight. You were protecting policy," he said evenly. "I was protecting reputation," she corrected. And confusing it with patient care. Silence settled. Not hostile, reflective. Through the glass wall, a few nurses lingered, pretending to check charts while clearly watching. Word had spread across departments. Maintenance staff had heard too. A janitor who'd stepped into surgery and saved 2 lives wasn't something the hospital would forget easily. Vale followed his gaze. "They're going to ask you to stay," she said. He turned back to Noah. "I already work here." She gave a faint, humorless breath. Not like this. The offer hung unspoken but inevitable. In the hallway beyond recovery, a pair of board members approached with measured steps. Their polished shoes clicked softly against tile. Maribel intercepted them briefly, murmuring that the child was resting. They waited anyway. Elias noticed and straightened slowly. Vale studied him. "You don't have to face them tonight." "Yes," he said quietly. "I do." He stepped out into the corridor, letting the recovery door close gently behind him. The hallway felt narrower now, as if walls had drawn closer to witness what would happen next. The silver-haired board member spoke first, Dr. Rowan. The title was deliberate this time. "We'd like to formally discuss your return to surgical practice within this institution," he continued. "Under appropriate review, of course." Elias folded his arms loosely, posture relaxed but unyielding. "My son was denied admission under your review process," he said calmly. The board member shifted. "That will be addressed. It will be corrected," Elias replied. Vale didn't interrupt. Another executive cleared her throat. "Emergency triage tiers are being suspended pending revision." A small but significant shift. He studied their faces, calculating, cautious, aware of public optics and internal morale. "You want me back because I fixed a crisis," he said. "That's part of it," the silver-haired man admitted. "And the other part?" Vale answered this time. "Because the staff saw what happened," she said quietly. "They saw who you are." He held her gaze. The victory tonight hadn't been loud. It hadn't required shouting or humiliation in return. It had unfolded under lights, through skill, in front of witnesses. Crisis had exposed everything. He glanced back toward the recovery room, where Noah slept peacefully for the first time since arriving. "My condition," he said finally, "is simple." The board members leaned in. "No child is turned away from emergency care in this building again," he said. "Not for insurance, not for status." Silence followed. Then, slowly, Vale nodded. "It will be written into policy," she said. The executives exchanged uneasy glances, but none argued. Because tonight they had all seen what ignoring him cost, and what listening to him saved. "And it will be written clearly," he added, voice calm but immovable. Not buried in conditional language. The hallway lights reflected off polished floors as the board members absorbed that. Their authority had always lived in boardrooms and donor galas. Tonight it stood in a pediatric corridor under fluorescent hum. The silver-haired executive adjusted his jacket. "We'll convene first thing in the morning." "Not good enough," Elias replied quietly. Vale glanced at him, not with irritation, but with understanding. He continued, "Staff need to hear it now." Before rumors shape it into something smaller, the younger board member with sharp glasses nodded slowly. "He's right. Transparency protects us more than silence." A pause. Then Vale turned toward the nurses' station. "Call an immediate staff assembly. Surgical wing and ER." 5 minutes, whispers rippled outward as pages were sent. Word traveled faster than any official memo. Within minutes, doctors, nurses, techs, and even maintenance workers gathered in the central atrium beneath the massive glass ceiling. It was the same space where donors posed beside marble plaques. Now it held something else: accountability. Elias stood near the edge of the gathering, hands loosely at his sides. He didn't seek center stage. He didn't need it. Vale stepped forward first. Tonight, she began, voice carrying across the atrium, this hospital failed a child. A murmur moved through the crowd. And it nearly failed a donor as well. She didn't soften it. She didn't deflect it. Our emergency triage policy prioritized coverage tiers over medical urgency. That policy is suspended effective immediately. The room fell into stunned silence. Several nurses exchanged relieved glances. A respiratory therapist near the back exhaled audibly. Vale gestured toward him. "The man many of you know as maintenance staff," she said evenly, "is Captain Elias Rowan, former military trauma surgeon." Gasps. Quiet disbelief. Some maintenance workers straightened instinctively, pride flickering in their eyes. "He identified and corrected a catastrophic bleed-in, or 3, Vale continued. "He also diagnosed and guided the surgery that saved his own son." Every gaze shifted toward him now. He felt it, not as pressure but as weight. The weight of being seen fully. Vale didn't look away. "He will be joining this hospital as consulting trauma specialist while we formalize his credentials." Applause began hesitantly. Then stronger, not loud and showy, but genuine. He stepped forward before it could swell further. "This isn't about me," he said, voice steady, carrying without effort. "It's about the next parent who walks through those doors." The applause faded into attentive quiet. "No one in this building should hesitate because of paperwork when someone's bleeding," he continued. "Skill doesn't ask for insurance first." Several nurses nodded firmly. A maintenance supervisor near the back wiped at his eyes discreetly. "If you believe hospitals should treat people, not policies, subscribe with the bell on," Elias added naturally, a faint edge of intensity in his tone. "Because stories like this shouldn't disappear once the crisis is over." The words didn't feel like promotion. They felt like promise. Vale studied him as he spoke. There was no arrogance, no revenge, just clarity. The silver-haired board member stepped forward reluctantly. "Effective immediately, emergency admissions will operate under medical necessity alone." A ripple of relief moved through the staff. Maribel met his gaze across the atrium and gave a small, proud nod. Crisis had forced exposure. Publicly. In the very heart of the institution, the victory wasn't loud or humiliating, it was structural. Vale stepped closer to him as the crowd began to disperse. "You could have dismantled us," she said quietly. "I didn't want to," he replied. "Why?" He glanced upward at the glass ceiling where city lights shimmered faintly beyond. "Because systems don't fix themselves," he said. "People do." Her expression shifted, respect replacing residual pride. "And you're staying?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. Across the atrium, a janitor mopped near the donor wall, pausing briefly to look up at him with a faint smile. Elias looked back toward the pediatric wing. "My son comes first," he said. Vale nodded. Of course. The staff returned to their stations with new energy. Conversations buzzed in hallways, not gossip, momentum. Policy shifts would follow, legal language would be drafted, public statements prepared, but the most important change had already happened. The building felt different, less rigid, less untouchable. And as he walked back toward recovery, the title that had once limited him, maintenance, felt smaller than it ever had. Not because it lacked dignity, but because tonight, dignity had been reclaimed without stripping anyone else of theirs. He pushed open the recovery door again, the soft hydraulic whisper greeting him like something familiar now. The lights were dimmed further. The hallway noise from the atrium had faded into a distant murmur. Noah slept, chest rising evenly beneath thin hospital blankets. The steady beep of the monitor no longer felt like a threat. It felt like reassurance. Elias pulled a chair closer and sat. For the first time since stepping through the hospital doors hours earlier, his hands were still. They ached now that adrenaline had drained away. A faint tremor lingered in his fingers, not from fear, but from release. Maribel stepped inside quietly. "They're drafting the policy change already," she said softly. "Legal's in a frenzy." He nodded once. "Good." She studied him for a moment. "You didn't have to make it about everyone." "Yes," he replied gently. "I did." She smiled faintly. "You're not what they expected. I'm exactly what I've always been." Silence settled between them, comfortable this time. Outside the glass, Dr. Celine Vale approached but didn't enter immediately. She watched him beside his son, something thoughtful in her expression. When she finally stepped inside, her posture carried less authority and more intent. "We're scheduling a press statement in the morning," she said. "The donor's family wants to acknowledge you publicly." He looked up slowly. "That's their choice. And yours?" she asked. He leaned back in the chair, eyes drifting briefly to the ceiling. "I didn't step in there for recognition." "I know," she replied. There was no defensiveness left in her voice now. "We'll formalize your consulting position," she continued. "You'll have full surgical privileges once credentialing clears." "I've already contacted the medical board." He watched her carefully. "You move fast. When I'm wrong," she said quietly, "I try to correct it fully." He appreciated the directness. The monitor beeped softly beside them. Vale glanced at Noah. "He'll wake in a few hours. I'll be here." She hesitated, then added, "There's something else." He waited. "The board wants you on the Emergency Oversight Committee," she said. "They think your perspective might prevent blind spots." A faint breath left him, not quite a laugh. "They think I'll scare them into accountability. Will you?" He met her gaze steadily. "If that's what it takes." A corner of her mouth lifted, almost a smile. Footsteps echoed in the hallway as night staff rotated shifts. Word had spread beyond surgical floors now. Even cafeteria workers had heard. Maintenance had heard. He noticed two of them pause at the doorway briefly, offering small nods before continuing on. The quiet solidarity meant more than applause. Vale folded her hands loosely. "You don't have to answer tonight." He looked down at Noah again, at the IV line taped carefully to small skin. 10 minutes, he said softly. She tilted her head. "What?" That's how long it took for everything to change. Her eyes flickered with understanding. 10 minutes from dismissal to crisis. 10 minutes from arrogance to recognition. 10 minutes that redrew the balance of power in a building built on it. "I won't let that window close again," he continued. Vale's voice softened. "Neither will I." They stood in silence for a moment longer, no longer adversaries shaped by hierarchy, but two surgeons bound by what had nearly been lost. Finally, she stepped back toward the door. "Get some rest," she said. "You've earned it." He shook his head slightly. "Not yet." When she left, the room felt lighter. Maribel returned briefly with a cup of coffee and set it beside him without a word. He gave her a grateful nod. Alone with his son again, Elias leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. The hospital beyond the glass was still the same structure, marble floors, donor plaques, executive offices. But tonight, it had shifted. Not because a janitor became a surgeon, but because a father refused to let power outrank humanity. Noah stirred faintly, fingers twitching. "I'm here," Elias whispered again, and this time there was no barrier between them and care. Morning light filtered through the hospital's glass atrium, washing the marble floors in pale gold. The building looked pristine again, untouched by the chaos of the night before. Donor plaques gleamed. Fresh flowers replaced wilted arrangements. The illusion of control had returned. But something underneath had shifted. In a conference room overlooking the city skyline, Cameras were being positioned. Local media had arrived earlier than expected. The donor's recovery had made quiet headlines overnight, but whispers of maintenance surgeon had drawn sharper attention. Elias stood near the window, hands loosely clasped behind his back. He had changed into a simple charcoal suit, borrowed from hospital administration for the appearance. It fit well enough, though he felt more at ease in scrubs. Across the room, Dr. Celine Vale reviewed prepared remarks on a tablet. Her posture was composed, but there was no trace of the icy detachment from the previous evening. "You don't have to speak," she said without looking up. "I will," he replied calmly. She nodded once. The board members filed in, faces carefully neutral. Reputation management was second nature to them. But today felt different. This wasn't damage control, it was admission. The silver-haired executive adjusted the microphone. "We'll keep this concise." Elias didn't comment. Through the glass wall, he could see staff gathering in the atrium below, pretending to pass through while clearly waiting to hear what would be said. The press conference began with formalities, gratitude to surgical teams, acknowledgement of the donor's stable condition. Cameras flashed softly. Then, Vale stepped forward. "Last night," she began, voice steady, "this hospital confronted a failure in judgment. No defensive language, no euphemisms. A child in need of emergency care was initially denied admission due to insurance status. A murmur rippled through reporters. That policy has been suspended effective immediately," she continued. "Emergency triage will now operate solely under medical necessity." The silver-haired board member shifted but did not interrupt. Vale turned slightly toward him. "Captain Elias Rowan," she said clearly, "played a critical role in saving 2 lives last night, one of them his own son's." Cameras pivoted toward him. He stepped forward without hesitation. Flashbulbs flickered against calm eyes. "I wasn't here as a captain," he said evenly. "I was here as a father." The words cut through the polished atmosphere. "When my son was turned away, it wasn't a policy I saw," he continued. "It was a door closing. Silence filled the room. But when the crisis hit, skill mattered more than status. And that's how it should always be." A reporter raised her hand. "Dr. Rowan, are you returning to full-time practice here?" "I'm returning to make sure no parent stands where I stood," he replied. Vale watched him carefully, something like respect deepening in her expression. Another reporter asked, "Was this about class inequality in healthcare?" He paused, choosing precision over rhetoric. "It was about urgency," he said. "Bleeding doesn't wait for billing." A few staff members below the atrium exchanged quiet smiles at that. The board member stepped forward reluctantly. "We are establishing an emergency oversight committee, chaired jointly by Dr. Vale and Dr. Rowan." The title landed cleanly this time. No hesitation, no correction. Applause began softly among hospital staff gathered beyond the glass wall. It wasn't orchestrated. It wasn't required. It was earned. Elias stepped back from the microphone as questions continued, letting Vale address procedural details. He wasn't interested in spotlight. The structural shift mattered more. When the conference concluded, reporters dispersed to file their stories. Headlines would shape perception. Social media would amplify it. The hospital's image would survive, perhaps even strengthen. But that wasn't his focus. Vale approached him once cameras were gone. "You handled that well," she said. "I told the truth, that's rarer than it should be." They stood in quiet understanding. Below them, staff returned to stations with lighter steps. Maintenance workers walked taller. Nurses spoke with new assurance. A social ripple had begun, small but undeniable. 1 night, 10 minutes, 2 surgeries, and a policy that would outlast headlines. He checked his phone briefly. A message from Maribel, Noah awake, asking for you. That pulled him immediately from the window and toward the door. As he left the conference room, the silver-haired board member called after him. "Dr. Rowan." He turned. "We meant what we said," the executive added. "You have influence here now." Elias nodded once. "Then we'll use it wisely," he replied. And he walked back toward the pediatric wing, not as maintenance staff, not as reluctant hero, but as a father who had turned crisis into change. The hallway felt quieter now, though the hospital buzzed with the aftermath of press coverage. Nurses moved with purpose. Orderlies exchanged low conversations. Even the air seemed lighter, as if the building itself had exhaled. When he entered Noah's room, sunlight spilled softly across the blanket. Noah was awake, groggy, pale. "But I'm awake, Dad," the boy whispered, voice scratchy. Elias crossed the room in 2 steps and took his hand gently. "I'm right here." "You left," Noah said faintly. "For a minute," he replied. "But I was still fighting for you." The boy's brow furrowed slightly. "Did I almost die?" He didn't flinch at the question. "You got hurt," he said carefully, "but we fixed it." Noah studied him through heavy eyelids. "You were a doctor again. It wasn't a question." A slow breath left him. "Yeah," he admitted softly. "I heard the nurse," Noah continued. "She said you saved 2 people. He brushed his thumb over his son's knuckles again, steady and warm. "I did my job. You always say that," Noah murmured, drifting closer to sleep. He sat beside the bed for a long moment after the boy's breathing evened out again. Outside the glass, footsteps approached. Dr. Celine Vale paused at the doorway before entering. She carried no tablet now, no documents, just herself. "I thought you should know," she said quietly. "The policy amendment passed unanimously." He looked up slowly. Effective immediately, she continued. "No emergency denial without physician override, and that override must be documented and reviewed." He nodded once. "Good." She stepped closer to the bed, lowering her voice. The board also approved funding for a community triage fund. For families without immediate coverage, he absorbed that in silence. "Last night changed more than 1 line in a handbook," she said. "Yes," he replied. "It changed perspective." Vale watched Noah for a moment, then turned back to him. "I owe you something more than an apology," she said carefully. He tilted his head slightly. "You corrected it. I corrected the policy," she replied. "But I dismissed you." The word lingered. "You saw a uniform," he said evenly. "I saw hierarchy," she corrected. "And I let it define competence." He studied her expression, no defensiveness, no ego left clinging to it. "You're not the only one trained to think that way," he said quietly. "Hospitals are built on rank. And you dismantled that in 10 minutes," he gave a faint shake of his head. The crisis did. Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. "I'd like you to take the lead on trauma training reforms," she added after a moment. "Our younger surgeons need what you bring." He glanced at Noah again before answering. "I won't sacrifice being his father," he said. "I wouldn't ask you to." She meant it. The door opened again softly as Maribel stepped in, carrying discharge paperwork. "Vitals are strong," she said with a small smile. "If everything stays steady, he could go home tomorrow." Home. The word felt heavier than it should have. Vale straightened. "I'll leave you both to rest." She paused at the doorway. "And for what it's worth," she added quietly, "I'm glad you came through those doors." He met her eyes. "So am I." After she left, Maribel lingered. "You know," she said softly, "the maintenance team asked if you're keeping your locker." A faint smile touched his face. "I might need it," she laughed under her breath. "You've changed this place." He looked around the room, the quiet machines, the sunlight warming pale walls. "No," he said gently. It was always capable of this. That night, he stayed in the chair beside Noah's bed, dozing lightly between monitor beeps. No alarms. No running footsteps. Just steady rhythm. For the first time in years, he felt something close to balance, not between roles, but between purpose and peace. And when morning light returned again, it didn't feel like a reset. It felt like a continuation. Morning came softly through the pediatric wing windows, pale light settling over the quiet room where Noah stretched beneath fresh blankets. The monitors had been removed. The IV stand stood empty in the corner. For the first time since walking through the hospital doors days earlier, there were no machines between father and son. Noah sat up slowly, wincing only slightly. "Does this mean we're going home?" he asked. Elias helped adjust the pillow behind him. "Yeah." "Doctor cleared you at sunrise." A faint grin tugged at the boy's lips. "Guess you win." He chuckled under his breath. This wasn't about winning. Noah studied him carefully. It kinda was, he didn't argue. A knock sounded at the door. Maribel stepped in with discharge papers, followed closely by Dr. Celine Vale. This time she wasn't flanked by board members or cameras, just a physician checking on a patient. "Vitals are solid," she said, scanning the chart. "No complications. You'll need rest. No hero moves for a while." Noah smiled faintly. "Okay." Vale turned to Elias. "The oversight committee meets next week," she said. "I'd like you there." He adjusted his son's jacket carefully before answering. "I'll be there." Her gaze held his for a moment, no hierarchy in it now, only respect. "And the locker?" she added quietly. He raised an eyebrow. "It's still yours," she clarified. "If you want it," he considered that. The worn metal locker in the maintenance hall. The oil-stained gloves. The quiet anonymity. "I think I'll keep it," he said. "Reminds me where I stand." Vale nodded once, understanding more than he explained. After they left, Elias helped Noah off the bed and into his sneakers. Each small motion felt monumental, simple acts that had nearly been stolen by policy and pride. They stepped into the corridor together. Staff paused as they passed, not out of spectacle, but acknowledgement. A respiratory therapist offered a small salute. A janitor down the hall straightened, pride unmistakable in his posture. The atrium doors opened ahead. The same marble floors, the same donor wall, the same glass ceiling. But the air felt different. Near the entrance where it had all begun, the silver-haired board member stood speaking quietly with the younger executive. When he noticed them approaching, he stepped forward. "Dr. Rowan," he said respectfully. Elias didn't stop walking. "Policy revisions are already implemented," the man added quickly. "Emergency signage updated. Staff retrained." "Good," he replied evenly. Noah squeezed his father's hand. As they reached the very spot where security had once touched his shoulder, Elias paused. Not out of bitterness, out of awareness. The automatic doors slid open again with that same soft whisper. This time, they weren't closing on him. They were opening. Noah looked up. "You gonna keep being a doctor?" He thought about the question as cool air brushed against them. "I never stopped," he said quietly. Outside, the city carried on unaware of the shift that had occurred inside those walls. But inside that hospital, something permanent had changed. A door that once measured worth by paperwork now measured urgency by need. A chief surgeon who once guarded hierarchy now guarded humanity. And a single father who had been dismissed as maintenance had proven that true authority isn't assigned, it's earned under pressure. He glanced down at Noah. "You ready?" he asked. The boy nodded firmly. They stepped forward together into the daylight. "Before we close this chapter, tell me the next story title you want us to bring to life. Subscribe and don't miss our next story, They thought he was just a single dad janitor until the board meeting screen went black. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?